All right, let's go. Number 10. In 1901, French archaeologists excavating at the ancient site of Susa in present-day Iran uncovered a black stone monument over 7 feet tall, covered in cuneiform script. It was the Code of Hammurabi, dated to roughly 1754 BC. But buried within its laws was something older, references to a financial practice that predates the code itself by over 1,000 years. Sumerian clay tablets from the city of Uruk, dated to roughly 3000 BC, document something that should not exist this early: interest-bearing loans. Here's the scale of what that means. These weren't simple favors between neighbors. These were formal contracts. Silver, lent at a standardized rate, often around 20% annually, recorded on clay, sealed, with witnesses, with repayment terms, with penalties for default. 5,000 years ago, in the world's first cities, humans had already invented the concept of money making more money. Compound interest, debt.
The entire mathematical engine that drives modern banking, modern markets, modern inequality, it was running in Mesopotamia before the pyramids of Giza were built. But here's where the story becomes genuinely unsettling. Some of these tablets record something else. Defaults. Farmers who borrowed silver against a harvest, and when the harvest failed, drought, flood, war, the debt didn't disappear. It compounded. Some tablets describe debtors being forced to hand over their children as bonded labor to settle what they owed.
Archaeologists have found evidence that several Sumerian kings were forced to issue formal debt cancellations, wiping slates clean by royal decree, because the alternative was a population so crushed by interest that the entire economy would collapse. What's left now are thousands of these tablets, sitting in museum drawers, recording the very first time humans discovered that debt, left unchecked, doesn't just burden people, it breaks civilizations. And we built our entire global financial system on the same idea. Number 9. In 1924, the British archaeologist John Marshall announced the discovery of 2 massive, previously unknown cities along the Indus River, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, in what is now Pakistan and northwest India. The Indus Valley civilization, it turned out, had existed from roughly 2600 to 1900 BC, covering an area of approximately 1.5 million square kilometers, larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Here's the scale of what makes this terrifying in its precision. Excavators found small cubical weights made of chert stone used for trade and taxation, and when they measured them, weights found at sites separated by over 1,500 kilometers, cities that, as far as we know, had no central government, no king's name on any monument, no palace. The weights were identical. The same standardized ratio, the same units, repeated with mathematical consistency across an area the size of Western Europe. This wasn't a loose trade custom. This was enforcement. Standardization at this scale requires either a central authority capable of projecting control across an enormous territory, or something stranger. A shared system so deeply embedded in the culture that it didn't need enforcement at all, just universal compliance, silently, for 700 years. But here's where the story becomes genuinely chilling. The Indus script, the writing system found stamped on thousands of seals across these cities, has never been deciphered. Not by anyone. Not in 100 years of trying. We have the weights. We have the measurements. We have proof of an economic system precise enough to coordinate a population of millions across a territory larger than most modern countries. And we cannot read a single word of what they were trading, why, or who was in charge. What's left is silence in 2 languages. A script we can't read, describing an economy we can only measure by the weight of the stones left behind. And around 1900 BC, this entire civilization collapsed. The cities were abandoned. The standardized weights stopped being made. Nobody knows exactly why.
Number 8. In 1900, the British archaeologist Arthur Evans began excavating at Knossos on the island of Crete, uncovering the ruins of an enormous Bronze Age palace complex he attributed to the Minoan civilization, dating from roughly 2000 to 1450 BC. Among the ruins, Evans found something unusual: massive storage magazines, rows of giant clay jars called pithoi, capable of holding tens of thousands of liters of olive oil, wine, and grain. Here's the scale of what those storerooms represent. Clay tablets, written in an early script called Linear A, found throughout the palace, appear to record vast quantities of agricultural goods flowing into the palace from surrounding farms, and then flowing back out again. Not as trade, as distribution. The palace functioned as a central hub, collecting surplus from the entire island and redistributing it to workers, to craftsmen, to communities, based on need and labor, not on individual ownership or markets. It looked, to modern economists studying these records, disturbingly like a welfare state. Centralized storage, centralized distribution, 3,500 years before the concept of a social safety net was supposedly invented. But here's where it gets genuinely unsettling. Linear A has never been deciphered. We can see the symbols for quantities, numbers, units of goods, but we cannot read the language itself. We know the system existed. We can see its scale, written in clay, stacked floor to ceiling in storerooms built to feed an entire civilization. But we don't know who controlled it, what they called themselves, or what happened to the people inside it when, around 1450 BC, the palace at Knossos burned, possibly following the catastrophic eruption of the volcano on the nearby island of Thera, an explosion so massive it altered climate patterns recorded in ice cores as far away as Greenland. What's left are the storerooms themselves, empty now, the jars cracked, the grain long gone, the records of an entire economy sitting in an unreadable script, and a palace destroyed by a disaster so large it shows up in the ice at the opposite end of the planet. Number 7. In 1958, British archaeologist James Mellart began excavating a massive mound in central Turkey called Çatalhöyük, a settlement dating back to roughly 7,100 BC. Making it one of the largest and earliest known proto-cities on Earth, home to an estimated 5,000 to 8,000 people at its peak. Here's where it gets strange. Mellart's team and the decades of researchers who followed found something that, by every expectation of how civilization is supposed to work, should not exist. No temples, no palaces, no evidence of a ruling class. Houses were nearly identical in size, built so close together that residents entered through holes in the roof, walking across the tops of their neighbors' homes. Excavations found no marketplace, no evidence of currency, tokens, or standardized trade goods. No graves containing dramatically more wealth than others. For a settlement of thousands of people, occupied continuously for over 1,000 years, the absence of any economic hierarchy is, frankly, almost impossible to reconcile with everything we think we know about how large populations organize themselves. But here's where the story becomes genuinely unsettling. Çatalhöyük existed for roughly 1,400 years, and then it was abandoned, gradually, around 5,700 BC. No invasion, no evidence of catastrophe. The most widely discussed theory points to environmental change, but the truth is, we don't actually know. A civilization that, as far as the archaeological record shows, may have functioned for over a millennium without money, without rulers, without the economic structures every other civilization on this list depended on, simply ended. And nothing like it, at this scale, appears again in the historical record for thousands of years. What's left is a mound of mud brick houses, stacked on top of each other in dozens of layers, built over more than 1,000 years by a society that may have proven something modern economics still can't fully explain. That a large, complex human population doesn't necessarily need wealth, hierarchy, or money to survive. And then it vanished anyway. Number 6. In the 1930s, archaeologists working at sites across the Gulf Coast of Mexico, the heartland of the Olmec civilization, dating back to roughly 1500 BC, began finding something repeatedly in burial sites and ceremonial deposits: cacao residue. Chocolate, in its raw form, found not as food waste, but in context suggesting ritual and controlled distribution. By the time the Aztec Empire was documented by Spanish chroniclers in the 1500s AD, the system had become explicit. Cacao beans functioned as currency. Spanish records describe specific exchange rates: a certain number of cacao beans for a turkey, a rabbit, a length of cloth. Tribute records show entire regions of the empire required to pay taxes in cacao, by the tens of thousands of beans shipped to the capital. Here's the scale of what makes this disturbing. Cacao isn't gold. It isn't silver. It's an agricultural product. It grows. It rots. It can be eaten. And yet, across nearly 3,000 years, from the Olmecs through the Maya to the Aztecs, cacao functioned as a stable, controlled monetary system, traded across an enormous geographic and cultural range, with values precise enough to be recorded in formal tribute and tax documents. But here's where it gets genuinely strange. Counterfeiting was a documented problem. Spanish colonial records describe people creating fake cacao beans, emptying out the contents and refilling the shells with dirt or other materials to pass as currency. A counterfeiting crisis, in a monetary system based on chocolate, serious enough that colonial authorities had to address it directly. An entire economy built on something that could be eaten, hollowed out, faked, and weaponized. And it worked for thousands of years, until European silver arrived and the entire system collapsed within a few generations. What's left is the residue itself. Chemical traces of theobromine, the compound found in chocolate, detected in pottery and ceremonial vessels across Mesoamerica. The chemical fingerprint of a currency that no longer exists because it was eaten. Number 5. In 1533, Spanish conquistadors captured the Incan emperor Atahualpa, marking the beginning of the end for the largest empire ever to exist in the pre-Columbian Americas. A civilization that, at its peak, controlled a territory stretching over 4,000 kilometers along the Andes, with no written language at all. Instead, the Inca used something called quipu, knotted cords made of cotton or wool, with information encoded in the type of knot, its position, and its color. For decades, quipu were assumed to be simple memory aids. But research beginning in the late 20th century, particularly work led by anthropologist Gary Urton at Harvard, revealed something far more disturbing. Quipu weren't just notes. They were a functioning accounting and administrative system, capable of recording census data, tax obligations, inventory of goods across an empire of an estimated 10 million people, using a base 10 numerical system encoded entirely in knotted string.
Here's the scale of what that represents. An empire larger than the Byzantine Empire at its height, with a road network spanning the Andes, with centralized granaries, with a tax and labor system called the Mita that required citizens to work for the state. All of it managed, recorded, and audited using cords and knots, with no written language to fall back on. But here's where the story becomes genuinely chilling. The Spanish, recognizing the quipu's importance, ordered them destroyed, viewing them as idolatrous, or as records of wealth they wanted to seize without accountability. Thousands were burned. Of the few hundred quipu that survive in museums and collections today, the vast majority remain undeciphered. We know they hold administrative and economic data. We know the system worked, at imperial scale, for centuries. We cannot read most of what it says. What's left are knotted cords, locked in climate-controlled cases, encoding the financial records of an empire of millions. A language made of string and knots, mostly burned by the people who conquered it, and mostly unreadable by the people who study it now. Number 4. In 1880, archaeologists excavating in Egypt began recovering thousands of papyrus documents from sites across the Nile Valley, many dating to the Ptolemaic period beginning around 300 BC, though the underlying system they describe stretches back over 1,000 years earlier, into the era of the Old and New Kingdoms. The documents describe a system of centralized grain banking. Egypt's economy ran on wheat and barley, and rather than leaving storage to individual farmers, the state operated a network of granaries across the country. Farmers deposited their harvest. In return, they received a receipt, a written record of exactly how much grain they had stored, where, and when. Here's the scale of what that means. That receipt functioned as currency. It could be transferred, used to pay debts, used to pay taxes, used to purchase goods, without the grain itself ever physically moving. A farmer in one province could pay a debt to someone in another province using a piece of papyrus representing wheat sitting in a granary hundreds of kilometers away. This is, structurally, almost identical to a modern banking system, a paper instrument representing a stored asset, transferable without physical exchange, operating in Egypt over 2,000 years before European banking emerged. But here's where it gets genuinely unsettling. This system required something that, in the ancient world, was almost unthinkable: trust in a centralized, often invisible authority. A farmer had to believe that grain deposited in a granary hundreds of kilometers away, that he would never see again, that he could not personally verify, actually existed and would be honored.
Egyptian records describe periodic famines, and during these famines, the entire system depended on whether the granaries had actually been managed honestly, or whether the receipts represented grain that had quietly been sold, eaten, or simply never existed. What's left are the receipts themselves, papyrus fragments, brittle and dark with age, representing wheat that was eaten by people dead for over 2,000 years, a paper trail for an economy of trust, written on a material that crumbles if you breathe on it wrong. Number 3. In 1929, French archaeologists excavating at the site of Ugarit on the coast of modern-day Syria began uncovering thousands of clay tablets written in Akkadian cuneiform and other ancient scripts, dating to roughly 1200 BC, the Late Bronze Age, in the final years before a catastrophic collapse that would destroy civilizations across the entire eastern Mediterranean within a single generation. Among these tablets, researchers found something that looks startlingly modern: documents describing Phoenician merchants extending credit across vast distances. A trader in one port city would issue a written promise, a document that could be carried by a third party, presented in a completely different city, sometimes hundreds of kilometers away, and honored as if it were the original merchant standing there in person. The earliest documented letters of credit. Here's the scale of what that represents. This is the foundation of international trade as it exists today. Value, transferred not as physical goods or coins, but as trust, encoded in a document, honored across borders, across languages, between people who had never met. Phoenician trade networks, based in cities like Tyre and Sidon, stretched across the entire Mediterranean, from the Levant to Spain, from North Africa to Sardinia, connected by a financial instrument that required absolute confidence in a written promise. But here's where the story becomes genuinely disturbing. Around 1200 BC, the exact period these tablets date to, the entire eastern Mediterranean experienced what historians now call the Late Bronze Age collapse. Within roughly 50 years, nearly every major civilization in the region, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, numerous cities along the Levantine coast, including Ugarit itself, was destroyed, abandoned, or reduced to a fraction of its former population. The causes remain debated: invasion, climate change, earthquakes, systemic economic collapse, possibly all at once. What's left is Ugarit itself, burned, abandoned, never resettled. The tablets describing this sophisticated credit network were preserved precisely because the city that created them was destroyed so suddenly, so completely, that the clay tablets were baked hard in the fires that ended it, and then buried, intact, for over 3,000 years. A financial system advanced enough to move value across the ancient world, fossilized in the ashes of the civilization that built it. Number 2. In 1904, British archaeologists excavating the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus in modern-day Turkey uncovered small lumps of metal, an alloy of gold and silver called electrum, stamped with simple designs. These objects, dated to roughly 600 BC and attributed to the Kingdom of Lydia, are widely recognized as the earliest standardized metal coins in human history. Here's the scale of what changed. For thousands of years before this, as we've seen across this entire list, value was represented by silver weighed on scales, grain stored in granaries, knotted cords, clay receipts, cacao beans. All of it required trust, verification, or physical bulk. Lydian coins changed the equation entirely. A stamped piece of metal, of guaranteed weight and purity, backed by the authority of a king, King Alyattes, and later his son Croesus, whose name became a synonym for wealth itself. Within a few hundred years, coinage spread from Lydia across the Greek world, then the Persian Empire, then the entire Mediterranean. The idea was so powerful, so immediately useful, that it essentially never stopped being used again. Every coin in every pocket on Earth today is a direct descendant of those small lumps of electrum found at Ephesus. But here's where it gets genuinely unsettling. The Kingdom of Lydia, the civilization that invented the single most influential financial technology in human history, was conquered by the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great in 546 BC, less than a century after its coinage began. King Croesus, famously wealthy, was captured. According to ancient accounts recorded by Herodotus, Croesus nearly lost his life on a pyre before being spared. The kingdom that gave the world money, in the form we still use it today, was erased from the map within a few generations of inventing it. What's left is the coins themselves, small, irregular lumps of electrum sitting in museum cases, the first physical objects in human history created specifically to be value rather than to represent it. The technology outlived the civilization that created it by 2,500 years, and counting.
Number 1. In 1986, archaeologists excavating sites across ancient Mesopotamia, building on over a century of cuneiform tablet discoveries dating back to the 1840s, began compiling and analyzing thousands of clay tablets, recording something that, when fully understood, reads less like ancient history and more like a financial instrument traded on a modern exchange. The tablets, some dating back to the early 2nd millennium BC, record agreements. A buyer agrees to pay a fixed amount of silver now in exchange for delivery of a specified quantity of grain, oil, wool, or other goods at a future date, often tied to the next harvest. The price was fixed in advance, regardless of what the market price would be when the goods were actually delivered. Here's the scale of what that means.
This is, structurally, a futures contract, the same financial instrument that underpins modern commodity markets, agricultural trading, and a significant portion of the global derivatives market, which today is valued in the hundreds of trillions of dollars. Nearly 4,000 years ago, in the river valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates, humans had already invented the concept of locking in a price for something that didn't exist yet, betting on the future, encoded in clay. But here's where everything on this list comes together, and where it becomes genuinely frightening. These contracts required something every single item on this countdown also required: trust in a future that hadn't happened yet. Trust that the harvest would come in. Trust that the debtor would still be alive, the city would still be standing, the empire would still exist when the contract came due.
Some of these tablets were found in cities that, by the time the contract's delivery date arrived, had already been destroyed. By war, by flood, by the kind of sudden collapse we saw at Ugarit, at Knossos, across the entire Indus Valley. What's left are clay tablets recording promises about a future that, in many cases, the city itself didn't survive to see. A contract for next year's harvest, written by someone who had no way of knowing that next year, their entire world would be gone. And that brings us to where all 10 of these threads meet. Every civilization on this list invented something we still use today: interest, standardized measurement, centralized distribution, currency, credit, coinage, futures contracts. The fundamental architecture of every economy on Earth right now was built, piece by people living in cities we can barely excavate, speaking languages most of which we can no longer read.
And every single one of these systems, every one, existed inside a civilization that eventually collapsed. Not slowly, not gracefully, suddenly in many cases, within a generation. The Indus Valley cities abandoned, the Minoan palaces burned, Çatalhöyük emptied, Ugarit destroyed in the fires of the Bronze Age collapse. The Lydian kingdom conquered within decades of inventing coinage itself. The economic system survived. The civilizations that invented them did not. We like to think of our financial systems as permanent, as the natural, inevitable endpoint of human progress. Too large, too complex, too deeply embedded to ever really fail. But every system on this list felt that way too, to the people living inside it. The Sumerians lending silver at interest had no idea their tablets would outlast their language. The Phoenician merchants writing letters of credit had no idea their entire trade network would be ash within a single lifetime. The clay tablets, the knotted cords, the unreadable scripts, the coins outliving their kingdoms by thousands of years, all of it is still here, still readable in some cases, still untranslatable in others. Sitting in museum drawers, in storerooms, in the ground beneath cities we haven't excavated yet, waiting. The economy's ended. The evidence didn't. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.